gonna be.
All right, you're alive. We'll do a 30-second countdown.
All right, and we're live. Welcome to Finance
Happy
Fridays.
Friday.
Yes, indeed. So the conversation today is a little bit heavy, but I think an important one for what's going on in the world right now. Everybody's sort of seeing what is going on with the unfortunate news at Twitter, and there's a lot of companies out there right now that are evaluating reduction in force, RIF, and I think because this is an unpleasant topic, there's not necessarily a lot of good information out there about how to think about this if you are in the unfortunate position of having to help to steward this inside your company. And there's of course better and worse ways to handle these sorts of situations. So I guess to kick things off, how do you, where do you start if leadership comes to you and says, hey, we need to evaluate a reduction in force?
Yeah, it's super tricky, right? And every company is different. Every situation is different. I think as a finance person, you typically know what's going on with the company, particularly the financials. But sometimes there's some belief, or there's a conversation that's happened between the CEO and someone else that you might not have that information. So I think before getting into the list of headcount, before getting into salaries, any of that discussion, really having the conversation with the CEO, with the board, maybe the board, depending on the situation, with the leadership on understanding the latest. What are the goals? Is it really cash? What are the revenue goals? How do we get the company to a new spot where we're not continuously having to think about reducing the workforce or making other cuts? So just aligning strategy before you execute on anything.
How important is the upstream part? So one thing you just said that I thought was interesting is making sure we're not having to continually make reductions in force.
Right.
How do
Right.
you think about kind of getting that right the first time, so it's not like you do one now and you do one in 3 months and
Totally.
you do one in another 3 months?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I think finance really comes in. And if you have a strong foundation of financial awareness of the commitments the company's made, the debt obligations, any outstanding cash flow obligations, just having that complete picture, that's the first place to start. So, one, you just need to know what's going on from a cash flow perspective and what's coming up. The second part is then a little bit of game theory, right? Like once you make the first RIF, people are going to have different reactions within the company. Some people may leave. If you were recruiting for any specific roles, those roles may take longer to recruit for. It's going to have an impact on your customers, right? Especially if you're a big enough company, they're going to know about this from external or internal. It may have a morale impact on your sales force. And so thinking about those second and third order effects and playing those out, whether it's in a war room or a situation, or just having different smart people and different perspectives come together and play out the next 3 to 6 months until you're at a point where you're like, okay, this is potentially the bottom, right? This is where things get normal again. This is where conversations go back to growing the business, our customers. And until you get to that spot, I think you have to assume you need to have cash and have stability in operating the business until that point. So sometimes that means you cut less because you know that other people are going to leave, or sometimes that means you might need to cut more, right? Because you need to really motivate the people who are still there and protect their salaries, or even maybe give them bonuses to incentivize them to stay.
So I'm going to ask a $1 trillion question before we keep playing the scenario through, but
Yeah.
obviously nobody can time this stuff, but when you look at a market like what we're in now, you're sort of trying to project out to say like what how bad will it be, or what there's the Twitter scenarios where like he's coming in and buying this and trying to sort of like rethink the business, right? But there's a lot of people doing RIFs right now that are just like, okay, the growth projections aren't playing out the way we thought, or we're not sure what the next X amount of time is looking like. How do you in your mind like try to I don't know, shape up the scenarios, right, with an unknown future of how long or how, sort of like bad it might get or it might not get, right?
Right, right. So every business has a few key levers. Your model can get super complex. You have hundreds of rows, hundreds of drivers, but ultimately there are a few key drivers of your business. And for each of those drivers, I think putting together, those scenarios, like here's a 25% sort of pessimistic scenario. Here's like the median scenario we think is going to happen, and here's like a really optimistic scenario. And I think a lot of companies aren't really putting together those optimistic scenarios, but if you have those three scenarios for each of the key drivers of your business, and then sort of running with that to get to some quantitative estimate of what that future situation is going to be, that's within the company. Then separately, listening to the macro environment, listening to experts in this space, there are a lot of people saying, "Hey, look, this is the bottom, right?" And there may still be interest rate increase, but the or sort of second derivative of that increase is not going to be as fast as it's been the last 3 to 6 months. And so if you ride those trends out and you embed those trends into your estimates of customer growth and retention and all that, and it's a combination of internal data and external data that you have to put into your forecast, and maybe you take the 25% slightly pessimistic view. And I think it's a lot of companies are saying it's okay to not have super fast hyper growth right now.
So going back to the kind of the process element of this, you said that you mentioned the first thing to do is get in sync, right, with the other leaders and determine like why are we doing this, what's the hopeful outcome of this, and how do we hope to position the business. So with that information, then what if you're
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
responsible for trying to figure out what this looks like?
Yeah. Yeah, so typically the way I've seen it, and everyone has different experiences. I've done a couple of RIFs, some through COVID and prior companies and specific teams. You want to keep the information as tight as possible between the finance leader, the CEO, maybe one or two other people, for the sort of core decision of doing it. Right. So that's sort of binary, yes or no. Approximately how many do we need to cut? Approximately how many dollars do we need to save from this cut? So once that decision has been made, then there's potentially looping in the second layer of people. So whether that's your FP&A manager, whether that's your chief legal officer, or different companies will loop in different people, right? And the
Hmm.
purpose of that second layer is to inform the decision making with more specific cuts of the business. So going back to the goals again, if your goal was to we're not going to focus on sales for the next 6 months because we're not going to be able to sell anyway. We're just going to do R&D. We're just going to do content creation in-house. Then those goals translate to different types of headcount reduction decisions. And knowing how a specific role at the company impacts those goals, and sort of like almost like the elasticity of that role to that goal, right? So if you're not going to sell anymore, then maybe it's a reduction in AE headcount, right? Because if you don't have AEs, it's okay, you can still build product. But if your goal is to continue selling and not do any product development, then your goal is more revenue, and maybe you don't need as big of an engineering force to do that. So there's that first layer, I'd say, of people, 3 or 4 people max at the company who know. Then once that initial decision has been made, pull in another 2, 3, 4 people to help you analyze and make a decision about the quantitative aspect of this execution.
What about anything on the execution side of that? So you start to understand where you think the cut should be made. Is there anything that you found helpful, for roll, following through with that strategy, or further quantifying, or anything in terms of how that plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think once you've had the first cut, and all of this is iterative, right? Once you have the first list of people who you think need to be, reduced from the workforce, then it's very important to understand what relationships those people have with existing employees as well as with external vendors.
Mm,
For example, if you are working with a marketing contractor, you probably, and that marketing contractor is very important. You may not want to let go of the person who's the internal contact for that marketing contractor, right? Because you're going to sort of have two losses in that case,
mm,
and you might not have as strong of a continuity of work with that marketing contractor. Similar with engineering, right? If you have a set of engineers, maybe internationally, that are working on a project, making sure that those key points of contacts within the company are, you're just being aware, right? Not saying you need to keep them, you need to cut them, but just being aware that those relationships exist within the company. Then the second thing that is also, relates to dollars is tooling. Right? How many seats and how many dollars of seats are related to people you're going to cut? That might be a good thing. You might be able to get those dollars back, but sometimes you actually can't get those dollars back, and you want to make sure from your vendor contracts that you know which dollars you can get back, and you don't want to bake into your model some assumption that you're going to get, several $100,000 back because you're not going to use this tool, but then find out later in your contract that you have a 3-year agreement that you can't get out of, right? So being aware of those um, relationships and also commitments that the company has made is super critical to building an accurate model. Otherwise, you get into this situation where you make the cuts, you assume you can get rid of some vendors, you actually can't, then you need to make further cuts, and that's the situation you really don't want to be in with your employee base.
what about any mistakes, like, that you could caution people to avoid making, or things that you've seen that, like, maybe were unexpected in terms of the consequence it created,
Right,
that we could help
right.
people kind of avoid?
Yeah. So the first one is always the employee morale, right? Like, how are people going to think about this? Both the people, what's the relationship with employees who are leaving the company, and what's the relationship with employees who are at the company, and what's their relationship with each other, right? And that's something employers don't always have control over, especially the relationship between current and former employees. I don't have the perfect answers here by any means, but
Sure.
to get out ahead of that, I think there are a lot of things the company can do to set up employees who are leaving for success, making relationships with external recruiters, or even opening up internal recruiting resources for for those individuals, being in contact with companies that are hiring, basically trying to set those employees up for success. The relationships are long; they're going to last past this down cycle, right? So you want to maintain as solid of a relationship with all of your former and current employees as possible through this process. Then the second part is, once you've made a RIF and you have your current employee base, no one wants to be working at a company that is not growing, right? So ensuring your
Circling the
employee,
drain.
yeah, totally. You want to make sure that the current employees are still excited to be doing what your company's doing, really driving the value, the vision, and connecting the dots between what their day-to-day work is and how that's going to impact the company, customers, and how that's going to make the world better, right? Whatever your company is doing. And so really driving that home, allocating time, carving out time in your calendar for office hours, one-on-ones. That's super critical as you go through, the before and after of this process.
Love it. What else? Is there anything else that we should have covered in this?
Oh, there's so much. I think it's not the most jolly topic, but there's a lot we can talk about, right? There are like legal things, making sure that you're in compliance with any sort of labor force regulations in your state. There are other IT considerations, right? How do you manage laptops What benefits do you continue to offer former employees? Why do you offer those benefits? Equity vesting. What if someone's at 11 months and they're almost vested their 1 year tranche, right? What do you do about that? So there are a lot of HR, legal, technology items that you do need to think through as you go through this. But I think it all connects back to that initial conversation of what's the strategy for the company and how do we achieve that strategy, and with including this reduction in workforce, extending the company's runway, and having a higher chance of ultimately hitting those goals.
Yeah, and I think what you said too about, helping to, or really taking the time afterwards to spend the time with the people who are remaining. That's something that I've seen. It's just so, like, you really can't. It's never fun. It's an unfortunate thing, but you can use it as a catalyst for change, and the people who remain at the business can become even that much more invigorated with the thing if they see positive change, because
Yep.
there's a sense of they're left over, not left over, but they
Yeah,
still remain. They're part of the critical team, and
completely.
you can see good things come from that.
Yeah. And one thing I'll just like end on is I think there's a critical opportunity for finance to really step up and be a leader at the company. You're already a leader, but particularly in these times, people are going to look to leaders, look to thought, partners, people they trust within the company. And I think finance, along with HR and just general company leadership, but really finance needs to play that role and can play that role.
I think that's the perfect place to leave it. So thanks to anyone and everyone who came and listened. We do this every Friday at so it's 11 Pacific, 1
Yeah, we're doing a little bit
Central.
later today.
Yeah, sorry, some travel complications, but we will be here next week at 11 with who is this?
Vivian.
The VP? Yes, Vivian is the VP of technology or something like that. What is her title?
Yeah, she's a VP of technology operations and strategy at Salesforce. So essentially, she helps decide what technology Salesforce invests in, cloud, non-cloud, hybrid. Yeah, where Salesforce stores its data
Yeah,
and much more.
yeah, cool. All right. Well, we'll see you next
Thanks.
Friday.
See you then.